At 3:17 a.m., an American PT boat crept through black Pacific water, outgunned, outmatched, and nearly useless. Its torpedoes couldn't hit. Its guns couldn't penetrate. Then one desperate officer looked at a wrecked fighter plane and made a decision that would change naval warfare forever. At 11:45 p.m. on October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched behind the wheel of PT-48, staring into black water off Cape Esperance. He was 26 years old, 14 night patrols, 0 confirmed kills. Ahead of him, 3 Japanese barges slid silently through the darkness, carrying 60 troops, each men who would be shooting Marines by sunrise. Lynch knew the math, and the math was bad. His torpedoes weighed a ton apiece, packed with enough explosive to tear a destroyer in half. But the barges rode too high in the water. The torpedoes would pass harmlessly underneath. His .50 caliber machine guns rattled like thunder, but their rounds sparked uselessly off steel armor. This was the pattern now. PT boats spotted barges. Torpedoes missed. Japanese guns answered back. Boats burned. Men died. Around Guadalcanal, 6 PT boats were already gone. 17 sailors never came home. And every night, the barges kept coming. The men on PT-48 already knew how this night would end. If Lynch fired torpedoes, they would miss. If he closed the distance, Japanese machine guns would rake the deck. Every officer in Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had seen the same ugly pattern repeat itself across the waters of Guadalcanal. The enemy had adapted. When American aircraft made destroyer runs too dangerous, the Japanese switched tactics. Smaller boats, shallower draft, steel-plated barges that slipped through the darkness like ghosts. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, but there was nothing fast about fighting it. Each barge carried troops' ammunition food, 60 soldiers per hull, enough to keep the Japanese army alive another day. And there were dozens of them every night. PT boats were built to hunt ships, not ghosts. The twin .50 caliber Brownings on PT-48 sounded ferocious, hammering out hundreds of rounds per minute. But against these barges, they were all noise and no effect. Tracers sparked off steel. Armor plates shrugged them aside. Japanese gunners fired back calmly, methodically, knowing the Americans had nothing that could stop them. 6 PT boats had already been lost in these waters. Some limped home, burning. Others vanished completely. 17 sailors were dead, their names already typed into casualty reports no one wanted to read aloud. Commanders tried improvisation. Some crews bolted Army anti-tank guns onto wooden decks lashed down with rope and hope. One shot, manual reload. Fire once, then pray you survived long enough to load again. It wasn't a solution, it was desperation. What the PT boats needed was simple and impossible. A weapon that could fire fast, hit hard, punch through steel, and fit on a wooden boat never designed to carry it. As PT-48 crept through the darkness that night, Lynch knew something had to change. Because if nothing changed, the barges would keep coming, and the PT boats would keep dying. The solution didn't come from Washington, and it wasn't written in any field manual. No engineer had designed it, and no admiral had approved it. It was lying broken and forgotten in the coral dust of Henderson Field. At dawn the next morning, Lieutenant Robert Lynch walked slowly across the airstrip. Around him were the remains of weeks of fighting twisted aluminum-shattered propellers, burned-out fighter planes that had died trying to land under Japanese bombs. Henderson Field had become a graveyard, a place where aircraft came apart faster than they could be repaired. Most of the wrecks were beyond saving. Engines were seized, wings torn away, fuselages split open. Mechanics had already stripped anything useful: radios, instruments, control cables. But Lynch wasn't looking at wings or engines. His eyes kept drifting to the noses of the wrecked planes. Dozens of P-39 Airacobras sat half-buried in the coral. The aircraft was an odd design, with its engine mounted behind the pilot, leaving the nose free for something unusual. Protruding from the shattered propeller hubs was a thick steel barrel, heavy and unmistakable. A 37mm automatic cannon. Lynch stopped walking. The cannon was intact on many of the wrecks. The recoil system, the feed mechanism, the barrel, all of it still there. The weapon had been designed to fire explosive shells fast enough to tear through light armor and aircraft structures. Unlike torpedoes, it didn't care how shallow the target floated. Lynch began doing the math in his head. 150 rounds per minute, high explosive, armor-piercing. Enough firepower to rip open a steel barge in seconds. Behind him, 3 crewmen from PT-48 stood quietly watching. They didn't say a word, but they could see it on his face. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was a solution taking shape. There was no doctrine for mounting aircraft cannons on patrol boats. No brackets, no blueprints, no permission to remove weapons from crashed fighters. Navy regulations had never imagined a wooden torpedo boat carrying an automatic cannon meant for the sky. But Japanese barges didn't care about regulations. That afternoon, Lynch stood before his squadron commander with no paperwork and no formal request. Just a simple question driven by necessity. What if they took the guns from the wrecked fighters and put them on the boats? It was reckless. It was unauthorized. And it could get men killed. But doing nothing was already killing them. By nightfall, sailors carrying cutting torches and wrenches were walking onto Henderson Field. And the most dangerous field modification of the Pacific War was about to begin. There were no forms to fill out, no supply officers to convince, no doctrine to hide behind. When Lieutenant Robert Lynch asked for permission, it wasn't permission in the official sense. It was a commander looking at his losses and deciding whether rules mattered more than survival. By mid-afternoon, the answer was clear enough. At 4:30 p.m., 4 PT boat crews were walking onto Henderson Field with cutting torches, wrenches, and whatever tools they could scrounge. They had less than 6 hours of daylight. When the sun went down, Japanese bombers would come back. Work would stop, or men would die doing it. The first wrecked P-39 sat nose down in coral, its cockpit shattered by a 20mm round weeks earlier. The pilot had died instantly. No one had touched the aircraft since. Technical Sergeant James Coogan crawled into the nose section with a wrench set and a torch working by memory and instinct. He knew this weapon. Every bolt, every hydraulic line. 8 high-tensile steel bolts held the cannon in place. They were never meant to be removed in the field. Some refused to turn. Others screamed as they broke free. Hydraulic lines were cut. Electrical leads yanked loose. Metal screamed against metal as engine mounts were torched apart. It took 2 hours to free the first cannon. They needed 4. The second wreck fought back harder. Tropical heat had seized bolts in place. Hydraulic fluid had turned thick and gummy. There was no penetrating oil anywhere on the field. Someone dumped aviation gasoline over the fittings and waited counting minutes as daylight bled away. By 5:30 p.m., they had 3 cannons lying in the coral beside the runway. Not all of them would work. Coogan knelt beside the weapon's opening feed mechanisms, inspecting recoil cylinders. One was cracked useless. Another had a bent feed paw fixable with a file and time they barely had. The third was perfect. Good enough. There were no mounts, no templates. PT boats were wooden hulls designed for torpedoes, not aircraft cannons. What Lynch needed was something that could absorb recoil, rotate under fire, and survive waves at 40 knots. Henderson Field's machine shop had 1 lathe, 1 drill press, and a welder that kept cutting out as fuel ran low. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey sketched a solution in grease pencil on scrap metal. Simple, ugly strong. A steel plate, a vertical pipe, a rotating collar. Nothing elegant, everything necessary. Welding began as the sun disappeared. 5 minutes of arc. Generator overheats. Cool down. Weld again. By 9:00 p.m., the mount stood finished, crooked, scorched, barely beautiful. It looked like it belonged in a high school shop class, not a warship. But it would hold. They loaded the cannon onto a truck and drove for the docks. By the time it reached PT-48, the clock had already crossed into tomorrow. The gun had never been fired. The mount had never been tested. And Japanese barges were running supplies that very night. By the time the cannon reached the dock, it was already past midnight. PT-48 waited in the dark, its wooden hull rocking gently against the pier, unaware it was about to become something no one had ever built before. Lynch stood on deck as the Higgins boat eased alongside its cargo, silhouetted against dim lights, steel-heavy and completely out of place. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. The crew went to work immediately. The bow deck of PT-48 was plywood over oak frames strong enough for machine guns never meant for a 280-pound automatic cannon. 4 mounting points had been marked earlier. Now they had to be drilled by hand. Each hole took half an hour of cranking sweat soaking through shirts as knuckles blistered and arms burned. Below deck, the oak framing groaned as steel bolts were driven through wood that had never carried this kind of load. By 1:15 a.m., the base plate was finally secured. They lifted the cannon onto the mount with ropes and muscle. The rotating collar slid into place. The yoke held. The barrel elevated, depressed, and after a shove turned. Not smoothly, not gracefully, but it moved. That was enough. Ammunition was the next problem. The cannon fed from horseshoe-shaped magazines, 30 rounds each, 40 pounds loaded. PT-48 had no ammo lockers for something like this. No racks, no system. The solution was crude and dangerous. 6 loaded magazines were stacked on the deck beside the gun, exposed to spray recoil and enemy fire. In combat, a loader would pass them by hand while the gunner fired. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew what that meant. There was no test firing, no stress test, no training. The crew had received exactly 1 set of instructions: point it, pull the trigger, change magazines when it's empty. At 2:00 a.m. on October 21, 1942, PT-48 became the first American patrol torpedo boat ever armed with an aircraft cannon. 9 hours earlier, the weapon had been buried in a crashed fighter. Now it was bolted to a wooden deck. That night, Squadron 3 went out on patrol. 4 boats slipped into the darkness, standard formation, standard orders. But PT-48 was different. On its bow sat a weapon no one had ever fired from a boat before. Gunner's mate. Second Class Harold Mitchell volunteered to man it. He'd fired 50 caliber Brownings on a dozen patrols. This was something else entirely. He sat behind the cannon on an ammunition box, 6 magazines stacked beside him, the barrel pointing into black water. The sea was calm, the sky overcast. Visibility barely 200 yards. PT-48 throttled down to reduce noise, creeping forward at 15 knots. Somewhere ahead, Japanese barges were moving again. And for the first time since Guadalcanal began, the PT boats were bringing something new to the fight. At 11:55 p.m., the radar operator's voice cut through the darkness. Surface contacts. Bearing 320. 4 of them. Lynch altered course without a word. PT-48 slid forward. Engines throttled back to a whisper, its wake dissolving into black water. Ahead, faint silhouettes formed against the darker sea, low shapes moving slow and steady. Barges. Japanese supply boats, steel-skinned, armed, carrying men who would be fighting by morning. The range closed. 3,000 yards. 2,000. On the bow, Harold Mitchell reached for the charging handle of the cannon. He pulled hard. Metal clanked. The first round slid into the chamber. The mechanism worked. That alone felt like a small miracle. At 1,500 yards, the lead barge began to turn. Someone had seen them. A split second later, orange tracer fire stitched across the water. The Japanese machine gun had opened up its rounds, walking closer with every burst. Lynch didn't turn away. He held course. 800 yards. Fire, he said. Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The cannon came alive with a violent roar. The muzzle flash lit the bow deck white, freezing men in harsh light. The recoil slammed backward into the mount. The deck flexed under his feet, and the gun kept firing. Explosive shells tore across the water and smashed into the lead barge at the waterline. Steel plate that had shrugged off machine gun fire split open like tin. One round detonated inside the hull. Another hit the fuel tank. Flame erupted. Men leapt into the sea as the barge kept moving forward, burning until it finally slowed and settled by the bow. Mitchell yanked the empty magazine free and slammed a fresh one into place. 8 seconds, an eternity. His hands moved anyway. The second barge tried to break away, turning hard. PT-48 followed, closing to 600 yards. Mitchell fired again. Shells punched through armor. One found ammunition. The explosion tore the barge apart in a flash visible for miles. The remaining barges scattered. One ran north, one south. Lynch chose the southern target. Japanese rounds began striking the bow. One punched through the plywood deck less than 2 feet from Mitchell's leg. He never stopped firing. Shells walked up the barge from stern to bow. The engine died. The hull drifted, men abandoning ship into the dark water. After 90 rounds, Lynch broke contact. Silence fell as suddenly as it had been shattered. 2 barges destroyed. 1 crippled. 0 American casualties. PT-48 turned back into the darkness, carrying a truth no one could ignore anymore. The cannon worked, and the war for the barges had just changed forever. PT-48 hadn't even reached Tulagi when the message went out. Lynch kept it short. No speeches, no embellishment, just facts transmitted over a crackling radio line in the early hours of October 21st. The salvaged aircraft cannon worked. 2 barges destroyed, 1 disabled. No American casualties. On the other end of the transmission, Commander Alan Calvert didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. For weeks his boats had been bleeding men and wood into the waters around Guadalcanal. Now in a single night, 1 boat had done what torpedoes never could. By dawn, every PT boat commander in Squadron 3 wanted the same gun. The problem was simple and brutal. Henderson Field had only so many wrecked fighters. Squadron 3 had 12 boats. The math didn't work, but nobody cared. Crews went back to the airfield immediately. This time they moved faster. They knew which bolts to cut first, which hydraulic lines to disconnect, what could be salvaged and what couldn't. What had taken hours now took minutes. The mounts improved too. Donald Frey studied the wear marks on PT-48's pedestal and redesigned it on the spot. Bronze bushings replaced bare steel. Rotations smoothed out. The guns tracked targets instead of fighting the mount. Each installation was better than the last. Ammunition became the bottleneck. Aircraft magazines weren't meant for prolonged surface fights. Each one had to be hand-loaded 30 rounds one by one. Aviation ordnance crews worked around the clock fingers. Raw hands black with grease. 40 magazines a day if everything went right. Barely enough. But the results kept coming. PT-40 destroyed 2 barges in 20 seconds of fire. PT-46 crippled a convoy before it could scatter. Japanese radio traffic changed tone almost overnight. Reports spoke of boats with heavy cannon and explosive shells. One message used a new phrase: demon boats with aircraft guns. By the end of October, the Tokyo Express wasn't running unchallenged anymore. Barges that once moved with near impunity now burned in the dark before they reached shore. Supplies didn't arrive, troops didn't show up. And Japanese commanders began asking questions they didn't like the answers to. Higher headquarters noticed. After-action reports moved up the chain. Numbers mattered. 8 patrols, 23 barges engaged, 14 destroyed, 0 PT boats lost. The data was impossible to ignore. What had begun as an unauthorized gamble on a wooden deck was turning into doctrine. The cannon wasn't just a weapon. It was changing the war 1 barge at a time. The paperwork followed the explosions. By early November, the reports from Guadalcanal were stacking up on desks far from the fighting. Typed summaries, hand-drawn diagrams, ammunition counts, kill tallies, cold language describing hot nights where barges burned and men jumped into black water. 8 patrols, 23 barges engaged, 14 destroyed, 6 damaged, 0 PT boats lost. For a Navy built on procedure, those numbers spoke louder than doctrine ever could. The dispatch reached Washington marked confidential. It described an unauthorized field modification aircraft cannons stripped from wrecked fighters, welded onto wooden patrol boats by men with no blueprints and no safety tests. Under normal circumstances, that alone would have ended the conversation. But Guadalcanal was not a normal circumstance. The Bureau of Ordnance read the reports carefully. They studied photographs of scorched pedestal mounts and ammunition stacked on open decks. They saw recoil data scribbled in margins. They saw results that could not be ignored. PT boats with cannons were surviving. PT boats without them were not. On December 7th, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the decision came down. Official authorization. Standardized mounts. A production run ordered back home. 100 units. Delivery in 90 days. 90 days. In Washington, that was fast. In the Solomon Islands, it was an eternity. The barges were still running every night. Crews didn't have the luxury of waiting for factory steel and polished welds. So they kept doing what they'd already learned to do, cutting, welding, improving. By the time the first official mounts left a contractor's shop in Rhode Island, PT crews in the Pacific had already built dozens of their own. The Navy hadn't invented a new weapon. Sailors had. What Washington did was recognize it. And that recognition marked a turning point not just for PT boats, but for how the war would be fought in the dark waters of the Pacific. Because once a field modification proves itself in blood and fire, it stops being an experiment. It becomes doctrine. And the little wooden boats that had been losing a quiet war were about to become something else entirely. Once the idea escaped Guadalcanal, it couldn't be contained. By December 1942, new PT boat squadrons were arriving in the South Pacific, fresh crews, clean hulls, standard armament. They came expecting to fight with torpedoes and machine guns, just like the manuals said. Instead, they found veterans who were burning Japanese supply lines with aircraft cannons bolted to wooden decks. Squadron 6 wanted the guns immediately. There were no wrecked fighters left to strip. Henderson Field had been picked clean. Every flyable P-39 was still needed in the air, and no commander was willing to disarm an operational aircraft. For a moment, it looked like the spread would stop right there. Then the war's logistics shifted. A cargo ship arrived in the South Pacific carrying replacement parts for Airacobra's brand new M4 cannons packed in Cosmoline, untouched by combat. Officially, they were destined for aircraft maintenance. Unofficially, they never made it that far. A flying boat carried them straight to the PT docks. By Christmas, Squadron 6 was installing factory-fresh cannons using the improved pedestal design. No cutting torches, no seized bolts, just clean steel meeting wood. The difference was immediate. The guns cycled smoother, the recoil systems held, reliability jumped overnight. By early 1943, 24 PT boats across the Solomons carried 37mm cannons. The results followed fast. Convoys that once slipped through darkness were shattered at close range. Barges burned before reaching shore. Japanese commanders responded by adding destroyer escorts, forcing PT boats to adapt again pair tactics, suppressive fire, disciplined disengagement. The cannon didn't make them invincible, it made them lethal. The war carried the weapon with it. In New Guinea, PT boats faced the same shallow draft supply traffic. The cannon worked there too. Narrow waters, jungle shadows, same results. Dozens of barges destroyed in weeks. The solution proved universal. Then came Europe. Off the Italian coast, German and Italian shallow draft vessels posed the same problem torpedoes couldn't solve. Mediterranean squadrons requested the cannon. They got it. And once again, the pattern repeated: explosive shells, burning hulls, disrupted supply lines. What began as a desperate gamble by one lieutenant had crossed oceans. By mid-1943, PT boats were no longer just torpedo craft. They were hunters. And the weapon that made it possible had started its life buried in coral dust, written off as wreckage, waiting for someone desperate enough to see what it could become. By 1944, The transformation was complete. PT boats that once relied on torpedoes alone now sailed with real teeth. The 37mm cannon, first salvaged in desperation, had become standard equipment. New boats rolled out of American shipyards, already armed their decks, reinforced their mounts, engineered their crews trained. What began as a gamble had hardened into doctrine. The numbers told the story. Patrols with cannons destroyed 6 times more enemy vessels than those without. Casualties dropped. Survivability rose. Japanese barge traffic withered under relentless night attacks. By late 1944 in the Philippines, surface supply runs were nearly suicidal. Barges burned faster than they could be replaced. The enemy adapted submarines, airdrops, but nothing matched the efficiency of those small boats with big guns. The men who made it happen rarely spoke of it. Robert Lynch survived the war. He ran dozens of patrols, earned the Navy Cross, and went home quietly to civilian life. James Coogan spent the war keeping guns alive with improvised tools and stubborn, skill-training gunners who would never know how close their weapons had come to failure. Donald Frey's crude pedestal, sketched in grease pencil under bombing threat, became the blueprint for factory steel, yet his name never made a headline. Harold Mitchell fired the first shot and kept teaching others how to do it right.